The autumn wind cut sharp through my threadbare coat as I led Mira along the muddy path toward Briar Glen's market. 35 years old, no wife, no children, I lived alone at the very edge of the village in a small wooden house that leaned slightly to the left, no matter how many times I tried to prop it up. I had a few rows of winter vegetables, an old horse named Thunder who moved slower every season, and Mira, my last goat, the one creature that still gave me milk every morning. She was the only real wealth I owned. Without her, the coming winter would be a long, hungry one. I had come to the market to trade her for barley and salt. That was the plan. Simple, necessary. The square was loud with the usual noise of late autumn. Farmers shouting about chickens, the blacksmith clanging his wares, merchants haggling over sacks of grain, and the village guards walking their rounds with bored expressions. Smoke from cook fires hung low in the cold air. I kept Mira close, scanning for anyone who might need milk and have grain to spare. Then I heard the crude laughter near the horse posts. A drunk orc man stood in the middle of a growing crowd, rope in his fist. The rope was tied around the wrists of a young orc woman. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her clothes were old and torn, her long black hair tangled, and a faint bruise darkened one cheek. But her golden eyes were clear and steady. She stood straight, silent, staring at nothing, while the man waved his free hand and bellowed in a slurred voice. "Who needs a servant? This one can cook, clean, carry heavy loads, and she doesn't talk back much." The crowd laughed. Someone shouted a joke about orc women and goats. Another man slapped his knee and called out that she looked strong enough to pull a plow. The orc girl never flinched. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't even look at the faces mocking her. That quiet dignity hit me harder than any shout could have. I told myself to keep walking. "You have only one goat left. Winter is coming. This is not your business, but..." Then her eyes found mine across the crowd. It wasn't a pleading look. It wasn't weak or broken. It was the steady gaze of someone who had already been pushed to the edge of the world and refused to fall off it. Something inside my chest twisted. The drunk orc noticed me staring. He grinned with yellow teeth and jerked the rope so the girl stumbled forward a step. "You there! Nice goat you've got. Trade?" The crowd roared with laughter. "One girl for one goat! What a bargain!" I looked at Mira. She nudged my hand with her warm nose, the way she always did when she wanted grain. Then I looked back at the rope cutting into the orc girl's wrists. My mouth moved before my brain could stop it. "I'll trade." The drunk yanked the rope hard, dragging her toward me. I stepped forward and blocked his arm. "Don't pull her like that." I handed him Mira's lead rope, then reached out and untied the rough cord from the girl's wrist myself. The skin beneath was raw and red. She watched my hands the whole time. Silent. When the rope fell away, the drunk laughed again, already turning toward the nearest ale stall with his new prize. The crowd started to disperse, still chuckling. The orc girl rubbed her wrists and looked up at me. Her voice was low and rough, like it hadn't been used much lately. "You just lost your goat for a stranger." I met her eyes. I lost a goat so I wouldn't have to watch a person get sold like livestock. She studied me for a long moment, as if waiting for the joke. When none came, she asked quietly, "What do you want me to do now?" "Nothing," I said. "Just walk away from this place. After that, you decide." She frowned, clearly unused to that answer. I turned and started back toward the village road. She followed a few paces behind, keeping distance, one hand near the small knife I could see hidden in the fold of her skirt. I didn't blame her. A man who had just traded his last goat for her had every reason to be distrusted. We left the market square behind. No goat, no barley, no salt for the winter stores, only the sound of our boots on the frozen mud and the knowledge that I had just done something very stupid. I still didn't know her name. She still didn't know mine. My name is Sylvan Marr, and that day I walked home with nothing but an orc girl who had been sold by her own father. And the strange, heavy feeling that my small, cold life had just become a great deal more complicated. The walk home from the market felt longer than usual. Ravenna stayed 3 paces behind me the entire way, her boots scraping the frozen mud. I could feel her eyes on my back, watching for any sudden move. Her hand never strayed far from the small knife hidden in the fold of her torn skirt. I didn't blame her. A man who had just traded his last goat for her had every reason to be distrusted. The wind picked up as we reached the edge of Briar Glen. My house sat alone on a slight rise, a small wooden structure with a roof that sagged in the middle and walls that had seen too many winters. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney. Thunder, my old horse, lifted his head from the patch of dry grass and snorted a greeting. I pushed open the crooked door. Inside it was dim and smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. One stone hearth, a rough wooden table, a single chair, a narrow bed against the far wall, and the small storage room I used for firewood. A few hides hung over the windows to keep out the worst of the drafts. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Ravenna stepped inside and looked around slowly, taking in every corner. Her golden eyes lingered on the bed, then moved to the bench beside the hearth. She asked, voice flat, "Where do I sleep?" I pointed to the bench. "You can take that for now. It's warmer by the fire. I'll sleep in the woodshed." She stared at me. "You bought me, and you're giving me the bed?" "I didn't buy you," I said quietly. "I bought the right to cut that rope off your wrists, that's all." She didn't answer. She simply walked to the bench, sat down, and folded her arms across her chest like she was waiting for the real price to be named. That first night, she tested me. I was stirring the thin stew I had made from the last of the turnips when she deliberately knocked over the water bowl on the table. The clay shattered. Water spread across the floorboards. She watched me, eyes hard, waiting for the blow or the shout. I set the spoon down, fetched a rag, and knelt to clean it up without a word. When the mess was gone, I brought another bowl, filled it, and placed it in front of her. "If you want to see whether I'm like him, go ahead and keep testing. But water is heavy to carry from the well, so maybe don't waste it next time." She looked at the fresh bowl for a long moment, then she drank. The next morning, I woke to the sound of sweeping. The floor was already clean, the hearth had been banked properly overnight. A pot of water was boiling over the fire, and the few winter vegetables I had left were neatly sorted on the table. Ravenna was folding my spare shirt, the one with the torn sleeve. "You don't have to do all that," I said. "If I don't work, you'll throw me out," she answered. "No," I told her. "But if you want to stay, we do the work together. You're not here to serve me." She didn't reply, but later that day I noticed she had rearranged the storage room so the firewood was stacked higher and drier. She moved with quiet efficiency, as if she had spent her whole life making broken things last longer. Over the next few days, I learned how much she knew. She showed me how to salt meat with half the usual amount and still keep it through winter. She pointed out which corner of the garden would grow the hardiest roots if we planted now. She mended my coat with strong nettle thread and showed me how to use bitter leaves to treat the cut on Thunder's foreleg. When she looked at my nearly empty store, she shook her head and said, "You would have starved before the first snow if you kept the shed like this." I laughed despite myself. "You're very direct. Hunger doesn't need pretty words," she replied. In the evening, sitting by the fire, pieces of her past came out in short, careful sentences. Her mother had died when she was small. Her father drank everything they owned, tools, blankets, even the winter grain. When nothing was left, he dragged her to the market and sold her for a few jugs of cheap wine and a side of salted pork. She spoke without tears, but I saw the way her fingers tightened around the edge of her bench every time she mentioned the rope. I never offered empty comfort. I simply added another log to the fire and let the silence sit between us. On the third night, I told her, "If you want to leave, I'll walk you to the Orc village over the ridge. You're free to go." She looked at me across the table, firelight flickering on her green skin. "You don't want me to repay the debt?" "There is no debt." She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, "And if I choose to stay?" "Then you stay as someone who shares this house, not as something I bought." She didn't answer right away, but when I came back from checking on Thunder that evening, the table was set with 2 bowls instead of 1. Steam rose from the thin stew she had made. She had even saved a larger portion for me. I sat down without comment. She sat across from me. Neither of us spoke, but the second bowl said everything that needed saying. For the first time in years, the small house felt a little less empty. Word of what I had done spread through Briar Glen faster than winter fever. By the next morning, people at the well were already whispering. Sylvan Marr traded his last goat for an orc girl? Bought himself a wife cheap. House at the edge is going to have trouble before the first snow. I heard the talk when I went to fill the water buckets. Ravenna heard it too when she walked to the miller's for a sack of barley we could barely afford. She said nothing, But from that day on, she stayed closer to the house, her shoulders a little tighter, her golden eyes scanning the tree line whenever she stepped outside. I told her one evening while we sat by the fire, "Let me speak to them, I can set the story straight." She shook her head. "If you speak for me, they will only believe I have no value of my own. I need to show them." I wanted to argue, but the quiet strength in her voice stopped me. She wasn't asking for protection. She was asking for the chance to prove she was more than the price of a goat. The chance came sooner than either of us expected. 3 days later, the village granary was found crawling with weevils. The communal stores that were supposed to carry every family through winter had been ruined by damp and poor stacking. The headman stood in the doorway shouting orders while villagers stared at the sacks with despair in their eyes. Winter was only weeks away. Without that grain, many of us would go hungry before spring. Ravenna heard the shouting from our yard. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the granary without being asked. The headman saw her coming and stepped forward, blocking the entrance. "This is village business," he said. "No outsiders needed." Ravenna stopped. Her voice was calm but clear. "If you do nothing today, in 3 weeks, that grain will be nothing but husks and dust." A few men muttered, someone laughed nervously, but I stepped up beside her and said, "Let her look. What harm can it do?" The headman hesitated, then shrugged and moved aside. Ravenna moved through the dim building like she had done this 100 times. She pointed to the corners where moisture had seeped in from the stone floor. She showed how the sacks had been stacked directly against the damp walls. She sniffed the air and wrinkled her nose at the faint sour smell already spreading. Then she gave clear, simple orders. Burn bundles of dried sage and wormwood to smoke the whole place. Move every sack onto wooden pallets off the floor. Mix clean ash into the ground to draw out the damp. Check each bag and separate the ones that are still good. The villagers looked doubtful. A few grumbled that an orc had no business telling them how to store grain, but I started moving sacks right away and slowly others joined. Ravenna worked beside us, lifting heavier loads than some of the men, her green arms steady. She never raised her voice, never acted superior. She simply knew what needed doing. 3 days later, the weevils were almost gone. More than half the grain was saved, enough to see the village through the worst of winter. When the head man came to thank her, he called her by name for the first time. "Ravenna, you kept us from starving." Some of the others began to look at her differently, not as the girl who had been sold in the market, but as someone who knew how to keep a village alive. Not everyone changed. One afternoon, old Garrett, a loud-mouthed farmer who had always enjoyed cruel jokes, leaned on his pitchfork near the granary and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Well, she may know how to save grain, but she's still only worth 1 goat." The words hung in the cold air. I felt heat rise in my chest and took a step forward, fists already tightening. Ravenna's hand caught my arm, gentle but firm. She looked straight at Garrett and said, "A goat at least gives milk every morning. What do your words give anyone, old man?" For a moment the yard was completely silent. Then someone snorted. Another man chuckled. Soon half the people standing there were laughing outright. Garrett's face turned red, but he had no answer. He muttered something and walked away. I looked at Ravenna. She stood a little taller than before, the faintest trace of a smile touching her lips. It was the first time I had seen her look anything but guarded since the day I cut that rope. From then on, our days changed in small ways. She no longer walked 3 paces behind me when we went to the well or the wood pile. She walked beside me. In the house, she scolded me when I forgot to eat. I patched the corner of the roof over the spot where she slept so the wind wouldn't reach her. She saved the best pieces of meat from my bowl. I split extra wood so she would never feel cold again. We never spoke of love. We didn't need to. The house no longer felt like a place where only one man lived. One quiet evening, while snow began to dust the yard outside, Ravenna stirred the fire and asked softly, "If you had known how much trouble I would bring, would you still have traded the goat?" I looked across the hearth at her. The firelight moved over her green skin and steady golden eyes. "Yes," I said. She tilted her head. "Because you felt sorry for me?" "No." I met her gaze without blinking, because I'm already starting to think I got the better end of the bargain. For a moment she said nothing. Then she turned back to the fire, but I saw the small private smile she tried to hide. The winter wind howled outside, but inside the little house the warmth felt different now. It felt shared. The rain came down in cold, slanting sheets the afternoon Brugor returned. I was splitting wood behind the house when I heard the shouting. A familiar drunken roar cut through the downpour. I set the axe down and walked around the corner. There he was, Ravena's father, standing in the muddy yard with two hard-looking men at his back. His clothes were filthy, his tusks stained yellow, and his eyes were bloodshot with cheap ale. The two strangers carried clubs and wore the sullen expressions of men who collected debts for a living. Brugor pointed a thick finger straight at our door. "Where's my daughter? I sold her fair and you still owe me." Ravenna stepped out onto the porch behind me. I felt her freeze. Her breath caught once, sharp, but she didn't retreat. She stood at my shoulder, rain soaking her dark hair, golden eyes fixed on the man who had once tied a rope around her wrists and offered her to the highest bidder. I moved forward, hand resting on the hunting knife at my belt. "She's not yours to sell anymore." Brugor laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "You traded one goat for her in front of the whole market. That makes her mine until I say the price is paid. Either give her back or pay what I lost when I gambled that goat away." One of the debt collectors spat into the mud. 20 silver pieces. That's what he still owes us. The girl was supposed to cover it. The rain hammered harder. Villagers began to gather at the edge of the yard, drawn by the noise. I saw the headman among them, cloak pulled tight, face grim. Before I could answer, Ravenna walked past me into the rain. She stopped halfway between me and her father. Water streamed down her face, but her voice was steady. "You don't sell me anymore," Brugor snarled. "I'm your father. You stopped being my father the day you tied a rope around my neck and stood me in the market like a goat." She lifted her chin. "You sold me for wine and meat. I was never your daughter after that. I was your debt." Murmurs rippled through the growing crowd. The headman stepped forward. "This needs settling in the square, all of you. Now, before blood is spilled on Sylvan's land." We walked through the rain to the village square. The stones were slick and dark. People came out of their houses, pulling cloaks over their heads, drawn by the promise of drama. Torches were lit under the overhang of the meeting hall. The headman stood on the raised stone platform and called for quiet. Brugor spoke first, voice thick with drink and self-righteousness. "By blood and clan law, she is my daughter. I had the right to sell her. This man," he jabbed a finger at me, "took her without paying the full price. I demand either the girl or the silver my creditors are owed." The two collectors nodded. I stepped onto the platform. "I traded my last goat to stop a man from treating his own blood like livestock. There was no contract, no bill of sale. She is not property." The headman rubbed his beard, clearly uneasy. "Border law was murky when orcs were involved." Then Ravenna walked up onto the stone beside me. Rain dripped from her hair. She looked out at the silent crowd and spoke loud enough for every ear to hear. "You all keep saying I was worth one goat, worth a handful of silver, worth a debt. So tell me, who among you has ever paid the true price for the years I cooked, cleaned, carried water, tended wounds, and took beatings so my father could drink? When I was hungry, who fed me? When I was cold, who gave me shelter? If I am only a thing to be bought and sold, why did none of you ever try to keep me when I was still free?" Her voice cracked on the last word but did not break. The square was completely still except for the rain. An old woman pushed through the crowd. I recognized her. Marta, who sold ale from a cart near the market. She climbed the platform without being asked. "I was there that day," she said, voice sharp. "Brugor was drunk and losing at dice. He dragged the girl out and shouted that she would cover his losses. He said loud enough for half the square to hear, 'A daughter can always earn more.' He sold her for 3 jugs of sour wine and a side of pork. That was the full price, nothing more." A low, ugly murmur swept the crowd. Even the headman's face darkened. Brugor tried to shout, but the two collectors were already backing away, sensing the mood turning dangerous. They wanted no part of a village ready to turn on them. Ravenna reached into the small pouch at her belt. The coins she had quietly earned helping villagers mend roofs, treat sick animals, and save the granary. She stepped to the edge of the platform and threw the pouch at her father's feet. Silver and copper scattered across the wet stones. "That is the last coin you will ever take from my life," she said. "Drink it, gamble it, choke on it, but you will never own me again." Brugor stared at the money glistening in the mud. For the first time he looked small. The headman's voice rang out, heavy with finality. "Brugor of no clan, you have no claim here. Leave Briar Glen before nightfall. If you return, you will be driven out with stones." The two collectors grabbed Brugor's arms and pulled him away. He cursed and struggled, but the crowd's silence was louder than any shout. They disappeared down the road into the rain. I stepped down and walked to Ravenna. She was breathing hard, rain mixing with the water on her cheeks. I asked quietly, "Are you all right?" She looked at me. Her voice was raw but steady. "Not yet." A small, fierce smile touched her lips. "But for the first time, I belong to myself." The rain kept falling, washing the last traces of silver into the mud. Around us, the villagers began to drift away, talking in low voices. For the first time since I had cut that rope in the market square, Ravenna stood in the center of Briar Glen with her head high and her hands empty, and no one dared call her a thing that could be bought. The days after the rain were quiet. Ravenna spoke little. She moved through the house with the same careful efficiency as before, but there was a new stillness in her. She was not sad exactly, no, she was adjusting. A person who had lived her entire life with a rope around her neck, even an invisible one, needed time to believe the rope was truly gone. I didn't push her. I kept the fire burning high, made sure the kettle was always warm, and left space for her to sit by the window and stare at the falling snow without feeling watched. Some wounds need silence to heal. The village, however, did not stay silent. Word of what had happened in the square spread. People began coming to our door. First it was old Marta asking for the recipe of the root soup Ravenna had made that kept us warm. Then a farmer brought his coughing goat and asked if she could look at it. Another wanted to know how she had saved so much of the granary grain. They no longer called her the Orc Girl or Sylvan's bought woman. They started calling her Ravenna. Every time I heard her name spoken with respect, I saw her stand a little straighter. Inside our small house, she worked her quiet magic. The storage room was now perfectly organized. Dried herbs hanging in neat bundles, firewood stacked high and dry. The windows were sealed better with fresh hides and oiled cloth. The hearth always held glowing coals, and the air smelled of wood smoke, dried lavender, and something that felt dangerously close to home. I had thought I was giving her shelter. In truth, she was the one turning my shelter into a real home. One night when the snow fell thick and silent outside, we sat across from each other by the hearth. The fire crackled softly. I finally spoke the words that had been growing in me for weeks. "I once believed I saved you by trading my goat that day in the market," I said quietly. Ravenna looked up, her golden eyes reflecting the flames. And now, I stared into the fire for a moment. The Datta then looked at her. "Now I think that goat was the cheapest price I've ever paid for the most valuable thing that's ever walked into my life." She was quiet for a long time. Then she set the spoon down and looked straight at me. "I could leave any time," she said. "The road is open. No rope, no father, no debt." "I know," I replied. She continued softer now. "So if I stay, it's not because I owe you. It's not because I have nowhere else to go." My throat tightened. "I hope not." Ravenna stood up, walked around the table, and stopped in front of me. She placed her hand flat against my chest, right over my heart. Her palm was warm from the fire. "I stay because I want to," she said simply. Those were the most beautiful words anyone had ever said to me. We did not marry with ceremony or feast. We didn't need to. The village simply understood. Ravenna belonged in that house. I belonged at her side. And no one ever again dared speak of her worth in terms of goats or silver. Our love grew in the small, ordinary things. The way she left the larger portion of meat in my bowl, the way I rose early to split extra wood so she would never be cold, the shared glances when someone mentioned the old market story, the quiet laughter that came more easily now. When spring finally arrived and the snow melted into shining streams, I walked to the market once more. This time I came home leading a small, lively kid goat. I tied it in the yard near the new patch of grass Ravenna had planted and called her outside. She stepped into the sunlight, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw the little white goat bouncing on unsteady legs, she stopped. Then she laughed, a real, full, bright laugh that rang across the yard like bells. It was the first time I had ever heard her laugh like that. I smiled. I named her Freedom. Ravenna walked over, knelt, and scratched the goat behind its ears. She looked up at me, her golden eyes soft. "A good name," she said. I stood beside her. This one isn't for trading. No one will ever be traded again. She took my hand. Her fingers were strong and calloused from work, but they fit perfectly with mine. Good, she said, because I'm not for sale anymore. We stood there together as the spring wind moved through the trees, a man who once lived alone in a cold house, and an orc woman who had been sold like property. Now we were simply two people who had chosen each other. The story began on a cold autumn day when I traded my last goat for a girl everyone believed was worthless. They laughed at her in the market square. They thought she was only worth the price of one animal. But Ravenna proved them wrong. She saved the village granary. She healed sick livestock. She stood tall before the man who had tried to break her. And most importantly, she took my lonely little house and turned it into a home filled with warmth, laughter, and belonging. I once believed I had saved her. The truth is far more beautiful. She saved me, too. From a life of quiet emptiness, she gave me purpose. From cold silence, she gave me warmth. From thinking I had nothing left to lose, she showed me there was still everything worth protecting. Her value was never measured in goats, in silver, or in the cruel words of a drunkard. Her value was in her strength, her kindness, her courage, and her choice to stay, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And I will spend the rest of my days proving that I am worthy of that choice.